going to get ourselves started, and we're so glad to see everybody here in the new year, and we are delighted to be able to welcome Sam Gray to leadership of the class today. Just to give you an overview of what's coming this month, we've got Sam leading us, and we'll get to know him a little bit better today. And then also on the 21st, Sam will lead us, and that'll be more talking about worship and more focused sort of on worship. And then next Sunday, the 14th, we will continue our Faith and Life series. You may remember last year, some of you have shared in the Faith and Life series, and Miriam Beardall will be sharing her story of how she sees God at work in her life, and we'll get to know her a little bit more. Miriam Beardall is sort of in charge of our children's Christian education curriculum. She develops the curriculum that we use for Christian education, so it'll be nice to sort of get to know her faith story. And then the last Sunday of the month, on the 28th, is the annual congregational meeting, so we will not have adult education, but we will gather for worship, and then after worship, we'll have our meeting, and we'll have the pancake fundraiser for the summer mission trip. So that's sort of an overview of what's happening this month for adult education. So we're going to get started with a word of prayer, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sam. Let's pray. Holy One, we come before you in this new year so eager and hope-filled for what you have in store for us as your people. I pray, Lord, that as we gather as individuals, as a faith community, and as people, as your children, as people grounded in this community, in this space, that you would show us the way that you know is right for us to go, individually and as a community and as a faith community. And I pray, Lord, that as we get to know Sam better, as we learn from him, as we delve deeper into what it means to be a singing community, that you would open our eyes, our hearts, our minds, our voices to sing your praises and to serve you and love you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Amen.
Amen.
So, good morning, everyone. Hi, I'm Sam. You feel free to say hi, Sam. Okay. All right, that's great. That eases my anxiety a little bit and lowers it. Can I have you stand, please? Let's stand. And we're going to start out kind of how we start out every choir rehearsal. So just stand and stretch, reach to the sky, get all of those creaky bones open, ready to go.
Those on Zoom, if they're able to do it.
Those on Zoom, if you're able, yes, if you're able to do it at home, feel free to. Otherwise, do so at your chair. Don't worry. We can't see you, so we're not going to look at you while we're doing it. All right, let's roll our shoulders back. Let's roll our shoulders forward. And let's take our heads and just ever so slightly around. Awesome. And let's breathe in. And out. And in. And out. Getting away all of the blizzard jitters of the last 48 hours, right? We're going to center ourselves one more time, breathing in. And then hissing tires. And let it go wherever it goes, wherever it goes, wherever it goes, that kind of thing. And breathe in again. And sigh. Woo! Very good, very good, very good. Shake it out, shake it out, shake it out, shake it out. Yes, yeah. Welcome to the adult education choir. Excellent. So we do something like that at the beginning of every choir rehearsal. Why would we do something like that at the beginning of a choir rehearsal, where we're breathing, where we're setting ourselves up, where we're sighing, doing different things? We would do more vocalises and different things like that. But anyone know why we start out things like that in terms of singing?
To relax.
To relax? What was that, Vicki? You said something?
Like your lungs. Are you getting
your lungs, getting your air, getting breath, right? Okay, yes.
These kind of things help us stand up more, open up.
Open up more, posture, good posture, that kind of thing. I've been told I have good posture. I don't believe it. But yes, right? All of those things. Now, why psychologically would we do that? at the beginning of a rehearsal, or at the beginning of any time that we gather as committed singers for God?
Make us focus.
Marcia, yes, make us focus, right?
Connect our body to our mind.
Body to the mind.
We're also somehow connecting to each other and kind of getting a little uninhibited.
Yes, connecting to each other and uninhibited from what, Wendy?
Well, like when we go, oh,
Yeah.
and then just like get over it, you know?
Right? Yeah. We're breaking into that vulnerability, right? We're breaking into that vulnerability. And I promise all of you that the choir members were not paid beforehand to answer. All right. But Wendy definitely gets an A+. All right. Have a seat, everyone. So the title of today's what I'm presenting today is Communal Worship, Why and How. Now, in a moment, we'll have a little demonstration of some things from our lovely choir members who are able to gather through the snow and blowing blustery wind of a blizzard. And if you catch on to it, I make a lot of blizzard jokes because I'm originally from northern Wisconsin and Minnesota. Whatever we had yesterday was not a blizzard, all right? So the very first, I'm going to put an image up here. This is the church I grew up in Ashland, Wisconsin. It is a building that was constructed in 1886. It was originally designed for pre-Vatican II Catholic worship. I grew up Catholic, and I worked in a Catholic school as like my first teaching job, pre-K through 8, teaching choir. You can see there's like the pipe organ. I learned how to play pipe organ on as a teenager, and the choir loft and different stuff like that. That's at the rear nave of the sanctuary. How many of you have ever seen a church, or in general have seen churches and church buildings kind of constructed in this model before, where the church choir is up in the back, different things like that. Organ maybe is in the back, and then up towards the front, you have an altar, that kind of thing. Many of you raise your hands. Yes, great. You also get an A+. How many of you have ever seen something like this before? Okay, yeah. This is kind of a zoomed in thing on that particular altar that's in the church that I grew up in. This is sort of pre-Vatican II, what is now generally considered in the Catholic Church like Latin High Mass. And what this is this is obviously the table right here. This is obviously there's quite the ornate altar, but the focus is really on this center column, and you'll see that the priest is facing away from the congregation, and at that time celebrating communion, opening up what's called the tabernacle, and bringing out the Eucharist, which in the Catholic tradition is Jesus Christ, literally. Like I like to say thanks to transubstantiation, which is the term that the Roman Catholic Church uses. Does anyone know why this orientation up until the 1960s was the orientation primarily through Christian worship that was not Protestant? Does anyone know why it was this particular viewpoint?
The priest was interceding to God.
Yes, Dell also gets an A+. Yes, the priest was interceding to God. The priest, obviously, you look at a picture like this and you think, oh, the priest is the focal point. They were, as the leader of the congregation, they are meant to be the interceder to God, as Dell said. They are taking the Eucharist, which is Jesus Christ in and of itself, and then turning around and presenting it to everyone else. So if you think of worship as, and you think of it within the Catholic tradition, there's this old, very like thousands of years of celebration and masses went into this up until the Reformation, which happened. Does anyone know the year the Reformation happened?
Celebrated 500 years a few years ago.
We did.
Yeah.
We did, right? So, yeah, so that was, oh my goodness, I should know this too. I was gonna be like, I was just gonna pull it out of my head, and then I didn't. In the 1500, I want to say it's 1552. 1550, along there, the Reformation happened. Martin Luther, I should know this. If Libby was here today and not feeling a little sick, she would be on me because she was raised Lutheran. But no, this was kind of the primary format for 1517. Thank you. That's why. There we go.
I said it.
Yeah, there we go. 1517, right? That just proves that you all are the experts and I'm not. But this mode of worship was kind of the mode up until the Reformation, when Martin Luther and various places took different ways of doing things based on cultural traditions and whatnot. But the primary mode was that you have an altar and that is the focus up front of the sanctuary. Now, if we think about our sanctuary here at Potomac Presbyterian Church, what do we see up front? That might be different than this picture.
The pulpit.
Pulpit. Why would the pulpit be up front in a Reformed tradition?
Preaching of the word is primary.
Preaching of the word is primary. Dell is getting like an A triple plus. Okay, he's got like 105%, y'all. Let's get going. Right? Yes, the pulpit, the preaching of the word is primary. Why is the preaching of the word primary to communal worship for us as Presbyterians? Ooh. Anyone want to give a shot? And don't worry, Pastor Emily won't judge you. Why is the preaching of the word the focal point of our worship?
Because we all can read the word now, so we're learning more about the word, right?
Yes, along the right lines, Vicky. Totally, yes. Because we're learning about the word, we're learning these things, we're doing these different things, we're sharing that, right? You have to think back 1517. The Gutenberg printing press wasn't invented, right? So there was no primary way of sharing Jesus's word unless you were a priest, where it was your primary responsibility to be educated and to do that. Nowadays, we don't have that, and instead we're passing out scripture. I mean, I don't know about you, but even on the college campus I was went to in undergrad, there were people handing out Bibles. There were people, spreading God's word in various different ways, right? So if we're thinking about this, now take a look at this. What are some similarities? What are some contrasts to the previous thing?
The cross is so focal.
The cross is focal, right? This is in Notre Dame in Paris.
Is that
Okay.
Mary? Is that the Pietà?
Yeah. Lots of statues, right? But there's still a tabernacle, right? In the Catholic, and there's still a tabernacle. Priests generally still face away. What they don't show you in this particular picture, though, is that off on these sides, there's a nave, and in that, it's literally called a place called the choir. And what that is where for the choir to reside and sit during the worship service, during Mass, and sing. What's interesting about Notre Dame and Paris, in thinking about the focal points of worship, especially in the Roman Catholic tradition and in Orthodox traditions, where there might even be a screen separating where the choir is from the community, is that there's this idea of heaven and earth literally built into these buildings, right? And the separation of, the choir is meant to symbolize the choir of angels, and the congregation is meant to respond. It's literally bringing down the idea of heaven to earth, God speaking, and us as human beings responding. And so that's a lot of this still informs worship space design, communal worship today in what we see and do in our services. Raise your hand if you've ever sang at a church service in our sanctuary. Yeah.
Get the application though.
Yes, that's great. Yeah.
Wow.
Raise your hand if you've ever sang in a choir and the congregation has responded to you at some point. Both vocally or different things like that. How many times in a worship service does Pastor Emily prompt us saying something and then we respond? Countless times, right? Like, yeah, all the time, right? This idea of call and response is a huge part of communal worship and a huge part of what we still do in our worship tradition as Christians. It started out with the idea of, oh, there's a choir and they are singing and they are resembling the choir of angels. That's a literal biblical interpretation, right? And then it transitions to, oh, everyone is meant to respond. Now, in Notre Dame in Paris, now I'm using this partially because I am like 45% French, so pardon me for the bias, but in Notre Dame, now they are renovating it and it's going to be complete. The estimated completion date is December 9th of next year, just before the Christmas season. The spire is already rebuilt too. There's a neat news thing about that a week ago. But in this particular tradition, and in Notre Dame, in the Anglican tradition, which is the Episcopal Church of England, there is still this separation a little bit of the choir takes the leadership role of singing, and then the congregation responds. And then during hymns, obviously, everyone sings together. Now, at Notre Dame, they have the grand organ, which is in the rear of the sanctuary, super high up. And then they have the choir organ. Now, on modern day organ consoles, oftentimes you'll have multiple manuals, which are keyboards. And you'll have one that is the great, and it's meant to be the louder stops and bring everyone in together and sing. And then you also have another manual on the organ that generally is called the choir. And it's meant to, again, be slightly softer stops, different things like that. And you're using that maybe to accompany the choir versus accompany the congregation. So still on even the instruments that are being installed and built today, we still have this kind of separation between heaven and earth. And in worship, we are to commune with God and be with God and put those two together. So I'm going to show you a little bit of how this is demonstrated in a mass at Notre Dame. Pardon, it is in French. So, but let's see if you can hear this. I don't know if you'll be able to hear it because it might be off of my.
It is off of yours. Did you press that little button when you?
I can do that. Here we go. Here we go. Lots of crazy organ. This is all improvised. You see the choir is up front. So this is all improvised beforehand, meant to symbolize the insanity of the world. I don't know if any of you knew this, but you can like see and watch like live streams of Notre Dame or various churches from throughout the world. Really weird hearing myself echo right now. Yeah. So there's a processional beforehand. And we're gonna just zoom up a little bit. Choir organ and choir. then everyone joins in. There's a cantor up front in this candle, up front of the Christ candle, and they're cueing everyone in the congregation to come in along with the organ. But this, it doesn't, to our ears right now, sound like, oh, it's really that separate. But in Notre Dame, they have an entire separate organ up in the front next to the altar versus the grand organ, which is in the rear of the sanctuary. And they'll have two organists going back and forth in the same hymn and the same song, doing all of this. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of kind of where this this idea comes from.
To mute either I or you.
Here, I will mute myself. There we go.
Yeah.
Boom. Awesome. Okay. So that gets us to, oh, call and response. We do a lot of call and response in worship already. We still do it. We do it in terms of choir, all of that different stuff. And we keep doing it throughout. I'm going to see if I can fast forward. Now, this is really small. I'm not going to have you read it, but I'll recite it to you all in a moment. But this kind of focus, I kind of want you to think about, all right, in what we just watched, we saw a choir of people leading a song, and we saw a congregation responding, and lots of different things required to make that all happen, right? But ultimately, what it is that we are together joining our voices in song. That's the definition of what a choir is. A choir maybe is a small group of people. We have in our minds kind of that a church choir, especially here, maybe here at PPC or at any church down the street, that a choir is a small group of people that are really good at singing that will lead us in worship, right? Some of you are chuckling. And you're like, yes, that's because I'm not a good singer. And let's flip that upside down right now, right? Getting back to the vulnerability piece that Wendy mentioned earlier, that the warm-ups that we did earlier today are meant to relax and break the tension in the room and have us be vulnerable. Because that vulnerability, when we extend ourselves into it, allows us to grow in different ways and rely on each other rather than just of our own devices, right? I believe, and I mean, Pastor Emily could correct me on any of this at any time, so please feel free to jump in. But I believe that this is kind of center to what we do as Christians and what we're meant to do as Christians is be together and united, even with our differences, even with our individuality, but that all becomes part of our worshipful family and part of who we are as an identity piece for our community. Biblical worship is choral worship. And when I say choral worship, that means singing, right? It's not just about the choir up front. It's not just about the amazing musicians that we could bring in, or me playing something on organ. Like, yes, that's an added cool thing, and I'll show off when I need to show off. But it doesn't need to be that, right? And that's not the focus. This is from an article on a website, an Organist website called No Tea, because apparently there's this weird thing between organists and caffeine, like coffee or tea and them being together. But essentially, the title of this article was Bring Back the Organ, and this is from 2016. This is about that time. And it's a reflection on worship from a particular pastor. Biblical worship is about choirs. Christian worship is fundamentally choral worship. 1 Chronicles 25 tells of David assembling the choirs of musicians, both vocal and instrumental choirs, under God's direct orders for service in the temple. In It's Nehemiah 12, right?
Yeah.
Nehemiah. All right. I
Yeah.
sometimes mess up. I'm from Minnesota, so we always. Anyways. In Nehemiah 12, we read of two great choirs that were assembled to give thanks to God for the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. One choir at the south gate of the city and one at the north. Quite possibly the first double choir motet ever in history. The Psalms are replete with dedications to the choir director of the temple. I'm kidding. Okay. Whether we are talking about the choirs of singers or the choirs of instrumentalists, biblical worship is characterized by choirs. Musicians who've rehearsed or who've robed and go into the choir loft or area and sing anthems to God and lead congregational singing are one choir, but the congregation is a choir too. One at the north gate, one at the south. Even the organist is composed of choirs, families of ranks of pipes or speakers, if they are organs digital, that sound good together. Biblical worship is all about choirs. Understanding what a choir is and does is it's not too much of a stretch to say that biblical worship is choral worship. Why would you not have choirs as the foundation of your church's music ministry? How can one not have choirs as the foundation of a music ministry? All of us together in here are a community, right? We are all here sharing this time together. We're all coming from different backgrounds. We have all survived the early 2024 blizzard of the last 48 hours, right? And we all participate at some level in choral worship, in worship coming together on Sunday mornings, right? Any questions about this or any questions at all? Sonia, you were raising your hand.
I'm
Yes,
very
ma'am.
anxious to have your input on this. I have in the past attended services and even belonged very briefly to a Church of Christ congregation. And my recollection is that music is not a part of the service in the Church of Christ. And I can't remember if it excluded vocal, but I lasted about 3 services. I just wish I wish I could have a better understanding of what the theological perspective is for that denomination. And I wish I had had that quote in my back pocket when I got into a conversation, maybe argument.
Well, and there's a lot, the Bible is complex, right? And I know in that tradition, in the Church of Christ tradition, the very first time I ever learned of that tradition, I was like 6 years old and talking to a kindergarten friend of mine. Her name was Jennifer, and she was in that denomination in Church of Christ. And she was like, yeah, there's no singing. She's like, there's no music. There's no those kind of things. And I was like, oh, that's a fun take. That's the thing I love the most. I would hate your church. And the thing is like, to each their own, right? The Bible is very complex. We kind of pride ourselves, and we hear this like communal kind of societal narrative that, oh, the Bible's easy. It's something that once you read it, you've got it. It's down. Once you've read the Bible cover to cover, and you don't ask yourself any more questions, you understand things. I'm still asking questions. I still ask myself questions all the time. I dive into the Bible or read parts of the Bible and then put it down. And then I contemplate, and then I worship. And then I hear Pastor Emily say something or Pastor Chris say something on Sunday. And then I'm like, well, I better open up the Bible again. And, look at it. And then I'm like, oh, well, now there's just more questions, right? Part of that yearning for more questions kind of surrounds this idea of vulnerability, right? And if we're not participating in music at some level, or artistry at some level, or creativity at some level, vulnerably, it's of my opinion that we're kind of like blockading the potential of really getting to know each other in worship. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord. And I, at the same time, I'll say that to this room, but if I was out on the street, I wouldn't go around and be like, oh, are you a member of the Church of Christ? Yeah, you should totally change your worship. Like, that kind of thing, right? Good question, Sonia. Any other quick questions before we move on into how this applies here, maybe at PPC? Yes, Dal.
There are divergences of opinion over what is sung by the choir and what
Yes.
music is part of the worship service. There's this Southern Baptist tradition. There are these hymns from the 70s and the 80s. And I think making a balance of that is always one of the problems of the choir of the church. So I wondered what your thoughts were on that. Yeah,
that's actually a great question to segue into the next thing. This
I'm on the payroll, by the way.
That's a really, really great point, because in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was this huge movement, and especially the 70s and 80s, I think it's the Willow Creek movement specifically, that really pushes kind of the idea of communal worship and different things in a completely different direction than the pictures I was showing you earlier, right? And trying to make worship more relatable and easy for those who are outside of our church denomination, maybe outside of the tradition, to come in and experience things. All of that is great stuff. The potential problem is that we end up maybe looking at things, and if we're constantly as a community just saying, oh, well, this looks cool, let's do this. Oh, well, this looks cool, let's do this. This looks cool. We're constantly changing then, and there's not the level of consistency. In my experience, the very first church job I ever had was at a small Lutheran church in Superior, Wisconsin, right next to Duluth. It was actually one of the churches that Libby grew up in, and I was hired as their director of music and organist and praise band leader. I was in charge of 2 services I say in charge of, I really wasn't in charge of. But I had responsibilities for a music ministry that was essentially of 2 churches in one building, because they had decided to split their service and go, one's contemporary, one is traditional. And the traditional had maybe 20 to 30 people, organ, piano, traditional church choir. The contemporary had maybe 20 or 30 people who didn't want to sing, but just really liked rock band in a church building, right? And I facilitated that. And one of the things that I did was bring those 2 together. And then we had one service. I remember it. I will forever remember it, because we had one service in 2015 after I'd been there about 1.5 years. And it was a joint service before our annual congregational meeting. And the church building itself held about 150, 200 people. And people showed up because they wanted to see what happened if we had organ and the rock band playing together. And the thing is that, like, these are merely, they're definite strong movements, and there's things that are important and things that we want to recognize in that kind of contemporary movement as part of our traditional worship now, right? Because the 70s and 80s, I'm saying this to a room of you all, but the 70s and 80s were 50, 60 years ago. So, I was born in 1992, I can say that. But out of that experience, I developed these 10 principles for a healthy music ministry. Worship is about God, number 1, not about us. So many churches I've worked with, subbed for, experienced, done different stuff. That one is misplaced, where it becomes about the musicians, or it becomes about certain congregants, or it becomes about various different things, but it's about God. That's what we're here to do. That's like, we give everything to God. If I didn't, man, I'd be disappointed in my postludes most Sundays. Number 2, the aim of music is to facilitate congregational singing. It's an important thing to live by. Number 3, all parts of worship should flow and be cohesive. That's also part of this thing. We have to think about not just during the worship service, but how does this tie to the worship service before it, to worship services 1500 years before? How does it tie to worship services that are going to come 1500 years in the future? That one scares people. Right. Music should reflect a wide range of experience. That includes contemporary traditions, traditional traditions. I just like to say that's worship nowadays. Like that's what it is. I have walked into churches and like seen worship services and been like, wow, that is fantastic organ. And then the very next thing we're singing, you know, a South African like hymn tune. You know, it's part of these things. It's different. It's cohesive. It's a wide range of experience, but it's cohesive within our Christian tradition. Music ministry should avoid the pursuit of fads. That one is somewhat controversial because there are people who are like, oh, well, this is the cool new thing and we needed to do the cool new thing. Yes, absolutely. Let's give it a try and let's do it. But let's be honest with each other about its role and its place. You know, if we're saying, oh, communal worship, okay, the worship that we do, and we love contemporary worship and we want to, you know, install smoke machines and lasers and different things like that. I mean, for me, that strikes up different feelings than what church is. Church in our society generally is synonymized with windows, pews, coming together for God, organ, a choir, people singing together. That's what it's synonymized with in our culture. And if you were to take, I saw this on a YouTube short of all things, and TikTok, I'll say it was a TikTok. It was a church TikTok, yes. Fads. But one of the things that I saw, and it kind of struck me a little bit hard, was that if you were to take the sound away from a modern, like Christian, what's billed as contemporary church service, and you were to put it side by side with like a rock concert, would you see any particular differences if the cross is not centered, if the pulpit is not centered, if things along those lines? Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, just a quick comment.
Yeah.
As you're bringing that up for that particular point,
Mhm.
it strikes me that all of these reflect back to number 1 on your list.
Yes.
And to some extent, if the music and what you just described, you know, the lasers, smoke, oh, this is fantastic. Look at this is great. Everybody gets wrapped up in the entertainment of the show.
Yeah.
And forgets about the communal worship
Number 1.
of God, which is number 1. So I think you make a good point there. I think, as you mentioned, you know, we can be open to different forms of music and the diversity of music between cultures, of things that bring us together as a group,
Yeah.
a diverse group. But at the same time, you got to be careful that it doesn't become a Broadway show.
Yeah. Now, there are times where a Broadway show can be about God.
Well, that's true.
Right? Right? Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor. No. But it's one of those things where like I think of like, oh, what's our children's pageant that we recently did. There are things in that we could make like add theatrical. That's a level of creativity that we absolutely should bring into our worship, right? But is that the reason that we're gathering for worship? No. The reason that we're gathering for worship is God, not us. Yes.
I don't know where these 10 principles came from, but from you?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I came up with this.
Oh, okay, so, but kind of building on what Bob said, I was also thinking about the number 1 and how the others, it was sort of like not directly connected. And in my mind, like, I just think of the music we make in church as an offering. And that brings it back to God.
Yeah.
And it really struck me when many years ago, I occasionally played cello in church and I was up in the choir loft and I would feel my heart starting to beat ahead of time, like everybody's going to be listening to me. And I just calm myself and just say, just forget about them. This is your offering to God. Yep. And then I just felt calm. Yep. Like God's going to be okay with whatever I offer.
Yeah. Right? Yes.
And then that just sort of spread. So I feel like my best way of worshiping God is through music.
Yeah.
That's my offering.
And that's, you know, I can definitely synonymize as like professional church musician, Wendy, I definitely can empathize with that feeling because that's what I'm trying to do all the time, whether it be organ, piano, voice, all of those things, and trying to extend to our church choir, our lovely church choir. But yes, list. I came up with this. If you want a poster of it, it's $5.99. I'm kidding. But the music ministry should be active in old and new ways. Everything done should be attempted with intention. It should be purposeful. It shouldn't just be done because we've always done it this way, or it shouldn't be done because it's the new cool thing. It needs to be done with purpose and intention. Again, focused back on number one. Music and worship should emphasize the voice of the people. Again, focusing on congregational worship, our communal voice. Number 9, the music ministry should practice vulnerability. Hey, you already have done that this morning by coming in here and stretching with me and doing breathing exercises. And then number 10, those leading should aim for progress, not perfection. Raise your hand if you're a church choir member and you've heard me say that before. Right? Progress, not perfection, right? I also, on another side of things, yes, I'm a professional church musician, but I also am a PhD student and who's minoring in sociology. And I took this quote from a book that I read for one of my sociology courses at the University of Maryland this fall. If sociology could teach everyone one thing with the most profound effect on how we understand life, it would be this. We are always participating in something larger than ourselves. And if we want to understand life and what happens to people in it, we have to understand what it is that we are participating in and how we are participating in it. I read that and then was like, oh, worship. I was like, it's a sociological construct, right? It's a thing that we do. We all take our own individualities, we put them together, we all are vulnerable, we practice this thing called religion. But for each one of us, I don't know about you, but for me, if I put a word onto it, it kind of makes it less than. It's this thing that we do. And it's a thing that we experience together, singing, being musical, participating. That brings me to how this looks in American history. Now, in American history, there's quite an interesting thing in that we are a country founded on religious freedoms and different things along those lines. And I could go into the whole political history of the United States, but I'm going to summarize it up in that singing and communal gatherings are centered to who we are as a culture. In today's modern society, and I've seen this as both a music teacher and as a person who's run stuff online and done streaming work and graphic design and all of these different things, using devices like these are great as a tool to connect us. But a lot of the time I have had to chastise middle schoolers for bringing out their phone in the middle of the choir rehearsal, different things like that, because we kind of have this, way of seeing our society through devices now versus through our own individual experience. Now, you can have an opinion on whatever that is, maybe, but that allows us to do really great things like have my dad join from Iowa this morning, which is really cool. But it also can have detrimental things where we isolate ourselves, right? And I think we're seeing a lot of that more and more in our society here in the United States, and in and around the globe as well. But I want to point out shape note singing specifically, though, because this was one of the first developments of American music, was taking the solfege scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and assigning shapes to particular notes as a method of teaching people. This started way back towards our country's founding, and continues through. I was going to share a slight shortened history of it, but it centers around kind of one guy named Lowell Mason. Has anyone ever heard of Lowell Mason before? Ooh. I mean, Corey pointed to me. He was like, "Oh, you brought it up at choir." Yeah. Lowell Mason was a church musician, teaching choir at a church, small church outside of Boston for a while, and then he traveled across the country. He was known as a singing master at the time. That is what they called themselves. He and a few others traveled different things around the country. We still sing one of the songs that he wrote and taught across our country every Christmas Eve, "Joy to the World." He wrote it. He helped develop shape note singing and using it as a means to be able to convey and teach various different churches throughout our country and Plain States. He would travel around, but he was not the only one. There was an army of these singing masters going out and around from church to church to church, teaching hymnody through shape notes. This little paragraph, this little writing here actually comes from the 1854 shape note book titled Southern Harmony, which is still used to this day by shape note societies. Now, what's really cool is that this whole process was developed within kind of the Reformed tradition in Ireland and Scotland, and then spread to the United States, and then was brought through by various singing masters in the early 1800s and the late 1700s, primarily as a way to teach churches how to sing better. And it's still used to this day. And what's interesting, at least for me, is that the whole point of this was never to have an organ, never to have a piano, never to have any kind of instrumental thing. It was strictly on getting the people of God to be singing as the voice of God. And that hits right at the core of what I am trying to present on in terms of our communal worship, why and how. What we do in worship and what we sing in worship and how we sing in worship is centered to our life as Christians, but it's also centered to the tradition that we have continued on replicating every Sunday since Jesus's death. And we'll continue doing that far into the future, participating, right? Shape note singing has a little bit of a different kind of way and twang to it. And so we're actually, I planned this out really well. Our church choir is singing a shape note tune for worship this Sunday. And the various members of that choir may or may not have brought their music. But this particular song that we're singing for worship, I think we'll do a little bit of it, maybe not a ton of it. Yes, Corey.
Question of your time. Why did they call it shape note singing? Was it literally like using shapes to teach people?
Yes, yeah. So you can see the triangle is for do, the little underscore half circle is
Oh, I
re.
didn't see the stuff under.
Yeah,
Okay.
yep. Yeah. And so if you open up a shape notebook, it's a way of teaching notation that's slightly different than what was done in the European tradition.
Okay.
Yeah. So
You know, I've known that, but I never got how that made it any easier than learning.
Yeah.
How is it any better?
So the reason that they say it's better is it's better to pick up on the pitch differences faster than and you have to also remember us in this room are vastly more educated than early Americans. And so identifying by shape and synonymizing that with these, essentially 7 pitches is a lot easier than remembering A, B, C, or being focused on like a piano-centric thing. Oftentimes in music nowadays, we teach kind of a very piano or keyboard-centered method for notation where you learn where middle C is, and then you learn the entire grand staff. This was designed so that you didn't have to learn necessarily the entire grand staff, but just learn your part. Are you soprano, an alto, a tenor, or bass?
And how does it designate different octaves?
Yeah, that's strictly by the placing of wherever the notes are. So for example, if you look at this little bit here, like here is the staff, right? If you were a bass, obviously you would sing triangle note down on the low staff than the high staff back then, but it's challenging to answer that question fully.
For me,
Yeah.
the difficulty in reading music is having to negotiate where it
Yeah.
is on the ledger,
Mhm.
and you're not escaping that.
Yeah.
You know, I have to stop and think when you
That's
get
true.
to a really low C or a low note.
Well, and the vast majority of shape note music, though, was based off of hymns and hymnody, so it's well within the staff. It's not ledger lines going above or below the staff. Yes, Charlie.
Yeah, I can tell you that some people have difficulty
Yeah.
tracking their note to note. Whether it's going up or down, is it 2 spaces down
Yeah,
or 3 spaces down? But if it's shaped,
they're
you
able
can
to
pick
make
up on
that,
it much
pick up on it much easier in the
Well, didn't
Right.
we say a lot of this was oral tradition? Like,
Yeah.
you had said a lot of it wasn't even them necessarily.
learning to read the notation. The way that this was taught was you would teach it part by part without the music. You would have soprano, alto, or soprano, alto, tenor, bass in a room shaped like a cross. And you would essentially teach the soprano part, and then the alto part, tenor part, all of the parts individually, and then put them all together. But you would do it completely without music. And so and then once your congregants or your choir got used to, the people who were there got used to singing that, then you would introduce the shape notes. And it was a way of convincing people, hey, you already know how to do this. Here's now what the meaning is. Okay, now let's take the next step and learn another one, and then another one, and another one. And so people like Lowell Mason, who ended up being the founder of music education in our public schools in the mid 1800s to late 1800s, because he got really good at doing that and really good at replicating that over and over again in various different communities. But any questions? Going once, going twice. Sold. If you are a choir member, would you mind standing up? And let's see what we can do. Ooh. Okay. I'll sing alto. Are we ready? Okay. 1, 2, 1, and. Regions of glory descends. Shepherds shall worship the babe in the manger. Lo, for his God, the bright angels attend. Brightest of lights of the sons of the morning. Dawn on no darkness and light us by day. Song in the east, the horizon adorning. God and Redeemer is slain. Over his cradle the dewdrops are shining. No light is then with the beams of the snow. Angels adore him and songbirds reclining. Maker of monarch and Savior of all. Brightest and best of the sons of the morning, dawn of the darkness and land us lighting. Soaring peace, the horizon of dawning. God with glory and redeeming his land. We have more than that we'll show you in worship. But yes. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Sam.
Yes.
I was just gonna follow that up. The
Yeah.
choir wanted to make sure you knew that the way that we are singing is that shape note tradition. So
They didn't
it's
want to.
Brassier.
It's
Nasal. It's nasal.
nasal, sort of, as opposed to phrasing all the notes
Yeah.
and making it sound beautiful. The shape note tradition is a little more earthy.
yeah. The choir was really concerned about at worship on Wednesday, the choir was really concerned about
Looked up on the-
whether or not the congregation would like come after us with pitchforks. Because, oh, you don't sound good enough. And I was like, they'll blame me if anything. No.
I noticed that
Yes.
each part doesn't really have that many notes.
No.
Like,
Listen to the
I
alto.
half the
Yeah.
music that I listened to Sam said the alto part, and I was like, it's practically all one note.
Yes, the poor alto part is
Yeah.
kind of a joke in any shape note singing, because generally it's only like 3 notes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Any other questions, friends? Otherwise, thank you so much for having me. And I do want to also mention Marianne next week. Woo! Yes. And then me again on the 21st. We'll talk a little bit more about worship. But yes, Del, you had a question.
I was going to comment. I was hoping you'd come back to Adult Sunday School and do a program on the great hymns of the church.
Yes.
Separate from the music and shape notes is what it is that you're singing about and what the lyrics are. And you find that there are people whose lives from early childhood to the memorial services and certain hymns that follow them through their life. And that tradition is important to maintain.
Absolutely.
And I wondered what your thoughts were on it.
Yeah.
And that would be another program.
Yes. No, certainly. I would love to talk about that sometime. Because I can think of about 5 or 6 in my own life that I heard as a little kid, that I sang with my grandmother and, 1 time, 2 times, and have followed me throughout my life, and showed up in ways even like in my marriage to Libby, where like, oh wow, that's your favorite hymn? Weird coincidence. And how that tradition and why that tradition still exists and why hymns exist and why are they focal to this idea of communal worship. Thank you, Del.
Some of those hymns can just make you weep.
Yes. Yeah,
Really emotional.
absolutely. That's a whole thing. I don't weep to just anybody singing a hymn. I weep to everyone kind of singing together. And the last thing I'll say to you all to kind of round this out, I think it's the 3rd pastor I ever worked with. His name is Victor St. George. He's at Elam Lutheran in Duluth, Minnesota now, but he was working at Zion, that church where we kind of took things from contemporary and traditional and merged it together. He once said in his sermons that he doesn't hear the voice of God as like the parting of the clouds and how it's maybe put in our society, but he hears it in odd things at any time from the people he works with and the people of God, which is you all. And I can't think, he also mentioned this too in his sermon, that, it's especially music and us communally singing, there are times where I get so moved emotionally because I'm hearing God's voice through the chorus of humanity. And that's the goal of us doing what we do every Sunday, singing together. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.